This interview with William Maxwell was conducted for the American Audio Prose Library by Kay BONETTI in October of 1995 at the Fales Library in New York City, where the author has made his home since the 1930s. William Maxwell, 87 years old at the time of this recording, is one of our most enduring writers, the author of 12 volumes of fiction and nonfiction, most recently All the Days and Nights, the collected stories of William Maxwell. Much of Maxwell's work is set in his native Midwest, and listeners already familiar with his work will know that he was born in Lincoln, Illinois, where he lived until he moved to Chicago at the age of 14, several years after the death of his beloved mother in the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 and his father's subsequent remarriage. But after graduating from the University of Illinois and taking his master's degree from Harvard, young William Maxwell went to New York City to make his fortune as a writer. This led him to The New Yorker, where from 1936 to 1976 he edited the work of John Cheever, John O'Hara, J.D. Salinger, Harold Brodke, Delmore Schwartz, Larry Wywoody, Vladimir Nabokov, and many distinguished others. Along the way, he earned a reputation for being, in the words of his colleague Brendan Gill, an odd combination of somebody who is both highly sensitive and hard as nails, a description we found to be quite consistent with Maxwell's assessment of his own life and work, and with the patience, care, and thoughtful attention he gave to our questions in this conversation. For the American Audio Prose Library, this is Kay BONETTI talking with William Maxwell. Mr. Maxwell, when you've had a long and distinguished life and career as you have, it's really hard to know where in an interview to begin, especially since you have written copiously about your background. But could we start out by getting on the record some of the details of your chronology in your life? You were born in Lincoln, Illinois, right?
Lincoln was a small town of 12,000 people. My mother's father was a judge. My father's father was a lawyer. Behind them on both sides were country people. My father's father died just as he was beginning to make a career of himself, but my father's youth was rather poverty-stricken. So he was always careful about money all his life, and preparing for a rainy day that never came. The pattern of our family life was that he was home. He came home Friday afternoon and left Tuesday morning, and traveled on the road with a heavy suitcase full of printed forms, which he used when he was visiting local agents, fire insurance agents. And my mother and father, insofar as I'm able to say, were very much in love with each other. When he came home on Friday afternoons, we were always on the front porch, my older brother and my mother and me and the dog, who would try to get between me and my father because I was the smallest and easiest to push aside. Anyway, he was embraced with affection when he came home. And we lived in a big old house with rooms that opened one out of another and were hard to heat. And I have a vivid memory of my father in October stuffing toilet paper in the windows to try to save fuel. His salary when I was a little boy was $3,000 a year, and on that he kept a carriage horse, and we lived in this extremely comfortable house in a comfortable way, and he put half of it away and bought a farm with it. I don't know how this was done. I think my mother must have been cooperative, though she was not frugal like his family, but she was careful. She must have been cooperative with it. And my older brother lost his leg when he was 5 years old, when I was only a baby. My mother's sister came by the house one day in a horse and carriage and stopped in front. She was on her way to an errand of some kind, and my mother came out to talk to her. And my older brother was a very strong-willed child who didn't take no for an answer. And he asked my aunt if he could go with her, and she said no, she couldn't take him. And so he began to climb up the wheel to get into the carriage with her anyway, and she didn't see it. And she finished the conversation and flicked the whip, and his leg slipped down between the wheels and was broken. And all during my growing up period, I was under the impression that it was broken in so many places. I must have been told this, that there was no possibility of setting it, and they had to amputate. In fact, what happened is that the family doctor was a drug addict. In those days, they dispensed their own drugs, so he had access to morphine or whatever. And he didn't set the leg at all. It was only broken. It was a simple fracture that anybody would have set, and that would have been the end of it. And he didn't set the leg at all, and gangrene set in, and they had to cut it off.
And this is a secret you were asked to keep from your brother, according
Yes.
to one thing that you have written. Is that fact or fiction?
Yes, yes, no, it's true. I assumed that he never found out. It wasn't a subject I ever discussed with him because the one thing he couldn't bear was for anybody to pity him. And people didn't because he was so accomplished physically. He could do wonderful things. He won the tennis championship, the singles, when he was in scout camp, with his wooden leg dragging you across the court. And he played football. He did everything. I saw him once climb up to the high diving board and jump off from that. And what took more courage than the physical part of it was that he had his bathing suit was there. His poor stump was exposed, and he faced through that and did it. Did a nice dive, and that was that. He was a very, very brave and remarkable boy, and we shared the same room. It was so much a part of my growing up that when I woke in the morning, the first thing I saw was his wooden leg leaning against a chair, and I didn't think anything about it. It was cork, I think, and pink, and not very convincing.
In speaking of the novel being a thing that, like a caterpillar, consumes whatever's at hand, I love that image. I just love it. And involving prestidigitation, hallucination when you don't know the answers, impersonation, turning water into wine. You say also sublime confidence that you must have to write a novel. And I wonder, too, if that couldn't be courage. You know, that image of your brother hopping out onto the end of the diving board because he was missing part of one leg and diving into the water. And the picture you've painted of yourself, of the oversensitive kid, the second son, the one who wasn't his father's son. But have you never thought of yourself as having great courage? Because what you've done with the material of your life, the kind of exposure that you've subjected yourself to, and the material that you work with, of the pain of the loss of the child losing the mother at an early age, it just seems astonishing to me, the courage that it must take to use this kind of material in your fiction.
I have learned that I am my father's child as much as I am my mother's. And when I was 6 years old, we went to Bloomington, which was 30 miles away, where my mother's sister lived, and there was a park, and in the park there was a lake, and you could rent bathing suits and swim. And my father, in his bathing suit, and I in mine, went into the water, and he taught me to swim by holding out his hand and putting me on his hand, my face down in the water. And I had absolute trust in him so far as anything like that kind was concerned. I knew that if he said something, he would do it, and he wouldn't play tricks on me. And he told me how to move my arms and legs and what to do. And so I did what he told me to, and suddenly had a moment of doubt and looked back, and he was standing 30 feet away from me in the water, smiling. I think what my father gave me was a trust in life, and I don't think it's courage so much as just trust in life. It's going to be all right. Do what you want to do. The only danger is not to do what you want to do. Don't cheat yourself.
And you speak of yourself as a child. There's always these wonderful scenes where people are driving in wagons out in the country. The grown-ups are talking about receipts, the women the receipts, the men the crops. And you said as a boy you always loved houses. Do you have any thoughts about that with respect to the universe that your fiction inhabits, with the mix of the town and the country?
I've always lived in New York City in a very circumscribed life, and tried to lead the life I would have led if I'd lived in Lincoln. And this was not particularly a conscious determination, it's just that I grew up in a small town and it marked me for life. The love of home is, I suppose, partly because I had it taken away from me, but I loved it before it was taken away from me just as much. And we've lived now for more than 50 years in a place in the country. I live partly in New York City and partly in northern Westchester, and the place in the country is arrived. It was not built by us. It arrived in the early 20s on the back of a truck. It was one of the very early prefabricated houses. And every time we had a child, we remodeled the house to make room for the child because it was so small. But you can only add small rooms onto a small house. You can't add huge rooms onto a small house, or you have something strange. But little by little, it came to fit our family life, as it was at that time. And any house I live in, I set roots, and the roots go down to China. And I know that neither of my children it isn't practical for them to live there, and that it wouldn't be for my wife after I died, and somebody else is going to live in that house. But it's painful. I want to go on living. I don't mind dying, I just don't want to leave the house, ever. I'm so deeply attached to home.
So then you went to the University of Illinois, and you thought that you would want to be a professor, so you went on to graduate school.
And it wasn't quite that simple. I really, from childhood, meant to be an artist. And I loved paint books when I was a child, and I drew, and that's what I thought I wanted. And in high school I took art classes, and I was enrolled in the Art Institute in Chicago when I finished high school. But of course, living in Chicago itself was a great thing because there was the Art Institute, and I wouldn't have had any such thing in Lincoln. Anyway, I was enrolled there, but my best friend in school had been a lifeguard during the summer, and he caught pleurisy, and his father and mother were afraid to let him go off to school. He was enrolled at Urbana in the University of Illinois, and they were afraid to send him because they didn't think he was well enough to go. And I said, well, I'll go down with him, and we can stay in my older brother's fraternity house, which we did. And while we were there, there was a full moon, and the fraternity house gave us the works, and there was an alumni there who was in the architecture department who said, why don't you study art here for a year and then go to the University of Illinois? So in the end, I didn't want to leave my friend, and I thought the campus looked so exciting. I stayed that freshman year, and in the course of the year I met a very persuasive English teacher who said it's an artist's life is very uncertain, and a professor's life is pleasant and guaranteed, and why don't you do that? And in the end, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an English professor. And so I stayed and graduated from the University of Illinois. and began to take graduate work. I went to Harvard for a year, and I wanted a PhD from Harvard because I liked the fact that their robes were lined with scarlet, and perhaps for snobbish reasons. But I had a block on the German language. I think it was because when I was a little boy, the papers were full of cartoons of Belgian women with their hands cut off and children on bayonets. Anyway, I had no trouble learning French or Greek or Italian. Not too much trouble with Latin. And with German, a total inability to memorize the vocabulary, so that every time I looked at a German word, it was as if I'd never seen it before. Well, at Harvard, you didn't get a degree in English literature, you got it in English philology in those days. And at Urbana, sooner or later, I would have run up against Gothic and Old Norse and Middle High German, let alone contemporary German. So I plugged along, avoiding the matter by taking things I did like and could manage, like medieval French literature, and taught freshmen by way of earning a living. And after about two years, I read a very lightweight novel by a novelist named Nathan. It was about some people, this was during the Depression, and it was about some people who all turned against money and decided money was not what they wanted and lived in a tool house in Central Park. And for one reason or another, it gave me the impetus to throw over the traces, and I resigned in 1934, somewhere along in there.
And where were you teaching then?
I was teaching at Urbana.
At Urbana, you had gone.
But I resigned at a time when there were no jobs anywhere in the whole United States. And but I'd saved up. Being my father's child, I was careful about money, and I'd saved up $1,500. And friends were kind and gave me a place to live and food in exchange for what I could do for them. And I began to write. I had worked as a boy in a farm in Wisconsin that was not an ordinary farm. It was more like a farm in the cherry orchard. And I began to write the novel while I was actually staying on the farm. And I was given a room in what had once been a water tower, but was remodeled. So there was on the first floor there was a room with a piano for Joseph Levine, who used to come there, the great Russian pianist. On the second floor was his bedroom, and on the third floor was a little study with a fireplace and a chaise longue and chintz curtains, a very pleasant place up among the treetops. And I would sit there writing this book. Several of the characters were just various aspects of me. But it was the story of a black man coming to spend a weekend among white people. And it was meant to be a comic novel. And it's funny, I guess, in places, but the trouble is the black man is no good. But I finished the novel that summer, and one of my professors at Illinois had a sister who had worked in publishing, and she sent it to Harper's, and they took it, and that was the beginning.
The Bright Center of Heaven.
Yes.
In an essay that you wrote about E.B. White, you said that when he went west as a young man, that in going west he was approaching his destiny by going as far as he could in the opposite direction. And as I read your essays in preparation for this interview, Mr. Maxwell, I thought that one of the more interesting things about them was the things that that you said about other people that could have perhaps just as easily been said about you. And I wonder if this might be one of them in terms of your writing life and your subject, that in going east you were approaching your destiny, but your your heart's material and everything is home, the Middle West.
Yes, I think it's perfectly true. The thing is that in those days, though there had been very fine writers in Chicago, the literary world was so strongly centered in New York. First time I tried to get a job there, I failed because there were no jobs, and my letters of introduction usually ended in the person that I had a letter to crying on my shoulder. The second time, I got a job with Paramount Pictures, reading books to see whether just to summarize the books to see whether they were good material for the movies. In the meanwhile, I had interviews. I'd gone to the New Republic where I had an introduction, and they soon found out that I didn't know anything about politics. And I had an introduction to the New Yorker, which had published one of my stories. When my interview with Mrs. E.B. White, was the fiction editor and art editor, really. In the course of the interview, she asked me how much money I would want, and I had been told that if I didn't ask for $35 a week, they wouldn't respect me. And so I took a deep breath and said $35 a week, and she smiled and said, "I expect you could live on less." And I could have lived on 10 quite easily. Anyway.
What year was this, 36?
1936. Anyway, after I was off doing those terrible things for Paramount, and I went to have dinner on 8th Street in a Chinese restaurant. And they wouldn't let me sit at a table by myself, being just a single person. And the bottom dropped out of everything, and I thought there's no place in the world for me, absolutely no place. And I went home to the rooming house, and under the door was a telegram that said, "Come to work on Monday at the salary agreed upon." I think if you absolutely hit bottom, there's nowhere to go but up.
And what was the salary agreed upon?
$35 a week.
So I take it from what you're saying that at this point you saw writing perhaps as something that you really couldn't make a living at.
Well, the first novel had been published with pleasant reviews, but sold. They published 1,000 copies, and it went into a second edition, and they sold 100 of that second 1,000. The rest are all remaindered. But I sat down and began a second novel, which was They Came Like Swallows, and I did the first section. It isn't a very long novel. I did the first section 7 times, most of it in that farm in Wisconsin. And the 8th time, I was at the McDowell Colony, and that time it stuck. And then I went on to do the rest of the novel, and it was in the hands of the publisher when I went to work at the New Yorker, and it was a Book of the Month Club choice, to my profound astonishment. The first payment was $8,000, which was so much money that I went into Walker Gibbs's office to tell him and could hardly walk, stunned by the overwhelming sum. I don't remember how much it made.
But that was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money.
The comparison.
All the time that I was working as an editor, I was writing, and the stories were published as a rule in the New Yorker, except that people kept resigning ahead of me, and so that I kept getting promoted and doing more and more demanding work, so that I wrote less and less.
And at the beginning of All the Days and Nights, you tell a story about yourself at the age of 25, which must have been that first time that you went to New York to try to get a job, trying to get on board a ship to be a sailor, because you had read things that talk like that's really what you ought to do. You've got to go out and get some experience, right?
You went to sea.
You went to sea in order
preferably on a 4-masted schooner.
Right, to learn to write. And I just I can just picture you. I love that picture in my mind of you at the age of 25. But you said that at that time, 3/4 of the material I would need for the rest of my writing life was already at my disposal. And first of all, I guess I would like to know, when did you discover that?
I don't remember whether I had written They Came Like Swallows, which was, of course, that material, or was about to. For a long while I was writing stories for the New Yorker, they were sometimes about New York, sometimes about France, sometimes about... I couldn't write about the Middle West really there because Ross had a map of what was possible to publish in the New Yorker in fiction. The stories could be about Florida, they could be about Hollywood, they could be about the East Coast. Wherever New Yorker readers went was what the fiction had to be about. It's rather tied my hands, and it was a good thing, because when I was free to write about the Middle West, as eventually they did accept, after he was gone, they did accept stories about the Middle West. I was old enough to deal with the material. I think I didn't so much begin to write about... The Folded Leaf is really about a college, and it could have been any college, though it is a Middle Western college, but perhaps the details made me... And details are everything in fiction. One can have all kinds of wonderful ideas, but if you haven't got the details to back them up, it's no good. The details were Middle Western. And somehow or other, when I sat down to work, I always, as the years went on, I more and more found myself thinking about the Middle West, not thinking about Westchester County or New York City or France. And it was as if that was really my imagination's home.
Limey Peters, in The Folded Leaf, to comfort himself about the loss of his mother, can go to bed at night and lie down, close his eyes, and he goes back to the house in Illinois, which, from the description, sounds like the house of your youth that you lived in with your mom and dad, and can go through every room, all the details, everything. And this seems to be something that you, too, are able to do.
Recently, I mean within the last 2 years, I had an extraordinary experience. In the night, I was awake. I wasn't asleep, and I wasn't dreaming, but I was in a state of extreme relaxation. And I suddenly found myself in that house. Visually, I saw it. I didn't remember it, which is quite a different thing. Memory is a kind of summarizing, but I was there, as it was when I left it when I was 12 years old. And I started to go from room to room, literally. I saw pictures on the wall. I saw the heights of the chairs and tables. I saw objects. I saw every room. It was the whole thing was intact in my mind, and I could move through it. And I went slowly from room to room, all through the downstairs, and all through the upstairs. In this state, really, it was very strange. There was something, it wasn't exaltation, but it was not an ordinary state of mind. And when I finished and had seen everything and reassured myself about everything, I thought, well, now I can come back whenever I want to, and it's all right to leave. And so I left.
Well, in talking about the material that the 3/4 of all the material you needed for the writing life, I want to remind you of what some of the things were that you said in that preface to All the Days and Nights. I had no idea that 3/4 of the material I would need for the rest of my writing life was already at my disposal. My father and mother, my brothers, the cast of larger-than-life characters, affectionate aunts, friends of the family, neighbors white and black, that I was presented with them when I came into the world, the look of things, the weather, men and women long at rest in the cemetery but vividly remember, the natural history of home, the suede glove on the front hall table, the unfinished game of solitaire, the oriole's nest suspended from the tip of the outermost branch of the elm tree, dandelions in the grass, all there, waiting for me to learn my trade and recognize instinctively what would make a story or sustain the complicated cross-weaving of longer fiction. Is the other fourth of that, the 3/4, is the other fourth the trade, learning the trade, and the instinctive recognition of what would make a story or sustain?
It does take a while before you know how to deal with the material. And I remember once having a conversation with Irwin Shaw, and he said he always made an outline for his novels and then went ahead and did it. And I never knew I would begin with a metaphor, really. The metaphor for they came like swallows was a stone thrown into a pond making a circle, and then you throw a second stone and it makes a circle inside the first circle as it's getting bigger, and you throw another stone and that's inside those other two. And I made the novel on that structure. And the folded leaf, I saw myself walking across flat territory, such as you'd find in eastern Colorado, toward the mountains. And I knew that when I got to the suicide attempt, I would have the novel. That's where the heart of the novel was. So I just kept walking toward them by creating scenes. So I never wrote a novel. I never wrote an outline for any novel. And sometimes I would run into serious trouble in time will darken it. I couldn't decide whether the hero went to bed with the young woman from Mississippi or not. So I wrote it both ways, and continued to write it both ways, chapter after chapter after chapter, and till it was like a fork in the road. And then I realized that there was a chance, even though I could do something experimental and publish them both, but it really wasn't what I wanted. So I faced the issue and decided that in the year 1912 he wouldn't have, and threw away all the rest of it. But it was a wasteful way of going about it. But I had to discover the form from the material. I didn't know. I didn't have a clear idea usually what I was up to.
Wasn't a matter then of learning your craft as time went on? Like were you more confident with each novel that you wrote as time went on?
No. I've never been, I've never known what I was doing, and only a feeling that I had to do it, really, but that surely there must be a better way of doing it or a better person to do it. But something I couldn't quite let go of, that this is the thing you had to have, and this is then finding your way to it. That the material is in the end your friend, and if you give yourself up to it entirely. For example, when I had the idea for So Long, See You Tomorrow, what floored me immediately was the fact that I had never lived on a farm. My father had a farm, and we went to it occasionally when I was a little boy. But the farmers' children stood off to one side, and I was shy, and they were shy. I never played with them. I don't think I ever even went inside the house. I saw farmers, but I'd never lived on a farm. And it bothered me so much that I spent a whole year looking at photographs, trying to read books about farmers' lives, and trying to get inside this closed place. And then one day I thought, oh well, I know now. I can trust my imagination. I can go ahead. I know. And I did know, to my surprise. You know so much that you don't know you know. If you see people of a certain kind, while you're looking at them, you're also coming to conclusions about who they are and what their life is like. And so it turned out I knew, to my surprise.
What was the real germ of that novel? Is the germ of the piece that's within the book now the memory of the childhood friend, and that you failed to acknowledge him when you saw him after this tragedy in a high school in Chicago? Is that the real germ of that novel, or is this one that was then constructed as the germ?
No, that is the real germ. I wrote a short story about the murder. It remained. I never totally forgot about it, because it's how many people have had known a murderer's child when they were young. And I wrote a short story about what, as I thought, really happened. This was maybe 10 years before I wrote the novel. And in the short story, the farm boy, was wakened in the night by the sound of a gun going off in the house. And he got up out of bed, and his father came out of the bedroom across the hall and said, "Don't go in there." And then the father went all through the house, gathering things up, and left. This was like 3 or 4 in the morning, before daylight. And the boy called his grandmother and told her to come over. And she said, "Can't it wait till morning?" And he said, "No." So she came. He was sitting on the steps in the dark. And he told her what had happened. And his father said not to go in the bedroom. And she said, "Well, somebody has to do it." And after that, the story moved on to the two of them sitting on the steps till the milkman came. And they got in his wagon, and he took them to the police station. I don't know whether it was a good story or not. The New Yorker is not given to that kind of raw violence, and I thought, so they rejected the story, and I thought, well, I just didn't handle it very well, and put it in a drawer. And then 10 years later, I was sitting in the country looking out the window, and I remembered that boy, and I remembered how I didn't speak to him in the school corridor. And I winced at the thought. And then I thought, that's very odd. This is now 50 years or more since that happened, and you're still feel that guilty about it. There must be something worth looking into. So that was the real beginning of the novel.
Well, in So Long, See You Tomorrow, you've plowed into a narrative method there that flies in the face of all the conventions in literature that at least your generation was a part of. Fiction was fiction, and nonfiction was nonfiction.
It's just the material. I had to follow the material. As you get older, you take more chances, of course. But I was delighted. The more unconventional it seemed to have to be, the more pleased I was that with how things were going. And it was a hard novel to write, and I used to find that sometimes in a paragraph there'd be one good sentence and the rest was worthless. So I would cut out the good sentence and put it in a folder. And I would say a very large part of that novel, every sentence, was in 10 other places before it settled down and locked into place. It was much, much, much worked over.
Well, also by this time, when you were writing So Long, See You Tomorrow, we had seen the surge in what's been called what was called parajournalism with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Or saw the work Norman Mailer did in that form. And now it's like time has come around to meet you at last. You know, we just call it fine prose now, and people teach classes in creative nonfiction. Were you ever affected by these kinds of things with respect to your choice of...
Did I worry?
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Or place yourself at any point.
I've worried many, many times over novels. I worried the most over the Chateau, I think, because I couldn't. I was afraid it wasn't a novel at all, and I did worry about the structure. And think what you're doing, you really can't do. But nevertheless, I went on until I found a way to do it.
And it sounds like that each time you've written a novel, you've, to an extent, felt like you had to learn to write the novel over again every time.
I never learned anything from any novel that was much use in the next one.
Let's talk about the Chateau. You say that you weren't even sure it was a novel?
I was afraid it was a travel diary and not a novel, because it followed so closely the experiences of my wife and me during a 4 months period in France in 1948. I was so in love with France and the French that when we came home to this little house in the country, I walked in, put the suitcases on the floor, and with my hat still on my head, sat down to the typewriter and wrote a page about what was in my head. And it was about a novel in which nothing more profound happened than hurt feelings. But I put all the ideas I had for this book on a sheet of paper and tacked it on the bookcase behind me, and never looked at it during the 10 years that I was working on the novel. After I'd been working maybe 9 years, the Irish short story writer, Frank O'Connor, who wrote for the New Yorker and who had become a dear friend, came to the country with his wife and asked how I was getting on with the book, and I said, well, I'm not getting anywhere. I have a grocery carton full of various versions. And he said I'd like to read it, and I was horrified because I wasn't in the habit of showing my raw material to anybody. And on the other hand, as his editor, I had seen his rough drafts for what I think is a masterpiece, An Only Child. And I couldn't very well say, it's all right for me to see your rough drafts, but you can't see mine. So he drove off with the grocery carton, and he and his wife read through it, all the versions. And sometimes the novel was told from the point of view of the French, sometimes from the Americans, sometimes the third person. All the mistakes, all the efforts to find my way through it. And then he wrote a perfectly wonderful letter in which he said he didn't understand what I was up to. But in the course of the letter, he assumed that it was a novel. He didn't assume it was a travel diary at all. He was treating it like a novel. What he said was it was really two novels. And a great weight fell off my shoulders, and I thought, oh, that's nothing. If it's two novels, anybody can make them into one. And so I did.
That book's been compared, I think, terribly superficially, to Henry James, you know, the Innocents Abroad, the American Innocents meeting the deep, dark, decadent experience of France.
It's not even remotely like Henry James.
Exactly, and one of the ways that it's really not remote is the fact of, again, flying in the face of 20th century convention about narrative method, because this is, again, what I find so remarkable about your work is the sublime confidence, to use your word, with which you just dispense with those kinds of expectations. In a Henry James novel, of course, we would be fixed in one point of view and all this sort of thing. And you, at the very end, just flat out addressed the reader. In the epilogue to that novel, you set up a dialogue between the persona, anyway, the narrator, and the reader at the end.
What happened really was that I reached the end of the narrative, but there were a lot of questions that weren't answered, and I felt that the novelist has a moral obligation not to leave the reader with unanswered questions. And the problem was then how to answer the questions if the novel's already over. I had a dear friend named Francis Stigmuller, who was a biographer, and he had read the manuscript through the first part. I needed somebody to tell me when the French people were speaking as the French people would, and when I knew how to have the characters speak bad French, but I wanted to be sure about the good French. And he read the novel and had some objections to it. He didn't like the Americans very much and thought they were kind of silly. And so it gave me an imaginary person to talk to, because I answered some of his objections in this thing, but it also set up the idea of a dialogue. And
took you back to France again several years later.
Again, yes. And so then, in that part, I was free to imagine being scenes that I wasn't present at, and was very happy to be back in France. But I loved doing the epilogue. But when it got to the publishers, a man named Harold Strauss, who was then an editor at Knopf, objected to the epilogue and wanted to cut it off. And I am always so tired out when I finish a book that I'm over susceptible to other people's ideas, and I didn't really know whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. But Alfred Knopf was sitting in the room, not saying anything, and I turned to him, and he said, "Have it the way you want it." So I did. And now, if I were to pick up the Chateau and that epilogue wasn't there, I think I would shoot myself. Many years later, we went to have dinner with the French family, and the woman, the deaf woman, was by then very old. She was in her 90s and lying on a chaise-longue in a Paris apartment. And I was very fond of her, and I knelt down beside the bed to talk to her. And she said sweetly, "You know you were very naughty to write that book. And because you didn't speak French, you didn't get things, you didn't understand things." And behind me I heard this whisper from her son-in-law, which was, "You got everything right." I suffered the torments of the damned about what it might do to them, since so much of it is taken directly from their lives. And with the terrible fatality that life is so fond of, at the time that the book came out and was getting book reviews, a member of the family whom I never met, or hadn't met at that time, came to America because she had a son in school who was graduating. So she saw the reviews and called, and we invited them to have drinks with us. And I discovered she was only halfway through the book when she was there. And she went home, she finished the book and went home and never told anybody. But years and years and years passed, and eventually I refused to let the book not only be published in France, but be published in England, because I thought English books would get across the channel so easily. And I didn't want to hurt them. And eventually they got hold of a copy and read it, and I had a letter from one of them, and she said, it was very naughty of you. Could we please have a copy ourselves? So the last time I saw them I said, now, a long, long time has passed. Is it all right to publish the book in France? Because there had been many offers for it. And they said, well, we'll read it again. So they read it again, and the answer came back, no, not now, not ever. Sometimes I have suffered the torments of the damned about describing real people, and where I was sure that I was perhaps causing pain. And in this struggle, the artist won out. There's a point at which I would not give up something which I knew was right, aesthetically and artistically.
Well, you've said that you've always thought that the narrator, the I, should be, and who did you say you learned that from, or you feel that you learned
E.B.
that?
White.
From E.B. White. That the I should always be every bit as much of a character in any piece that you've written. And have you ever had a sense in your writing life as William Maxwell that you were flying in the sense of convention or being old-fashioned in that regard?
I never worried about being old-fashioned because the books I've continued to read all my life have been the Russians. I wanted to write about people, men and women, and what's old-fashioned about men and women. They are just as they are. The thing about White is he is essentially an egoist, not an egotist, but an egoist, and he has to start from himself as the center of his observations. But that self is somehow made never tiresome, usually amusing, always likable, always acceptable. And I remember when I was younger trying to write stories in the first person or even novels, and they went on and on and on, were so garrulous, and I couldn't somehow rein them in because I hadn't discovered how to treat myself in a way that wasn't the total interior life. And the answer is to treat oneself as an outside person, as a character who therefore is manageable and also not the center of the action and not the center of attention, but somewhat on the side, visible and sometimes an actor, but only momentarily. So to find a place for you that is very much like the place you must find for yourself in social life, where you are not tiresome, but agreeable socially, and give other people a chance to talk to, so forth. When I could finally use the first person, I was happy, but I sort of, it was like venturing into cold water.
There's a strong streak in your work of the disparity between the inner self and the outer self, the face one makes to meet the faces and the real self. So what are you saying, that in using yourself as a narrator and a persona, that this was the sort of thing that you're also doing fictionally to deal with the material?
Well, I feel I am just not myself, and nobody is just themselves. We are all so many selves, a whole cast of characters, and now I'm one person, now I'm another, and there's a committee, and somebody's in charge of the committee, and that's the person that the outside world knows, but in the interior life is more or less bedlam.
How did you meet your wife?
She came to the New Yorker office looking for work. She wanted to be a poetry editor. She loved poetry. And there was no poetry editor, as it turned out. But she was lovely to look at. But I was in analysis and at a sort of standstill state that you get in therapy. And I did take her telephone number in case it was no, I guess I just automatically took it. And a year later, I sat up in the middle of the night and looked her name up in the phone book, and it wasn't there. So then I went to the files in the office, and it was there. And I trumped up some excuse to see her, because I had never forgotten her. She was indeed very beautiful.
Again, in another one of those places where you just, apparently anyway, just open yourself up. In the opening chapter of Ancestors, where you talk about meeting your cousin, your first cousin, the genealogist, who you'd really never known well, and he came to see you in New York, and you say in the book, well, what if I had laid my cards on the table? And you tell this story of a person who had been in love, I think you said, either 2 or 3 times to people that didn't love you back, and of having picked an apartment because you went into it unlocked and you liked the way it felt in the dark one night when you were visiting a friend, and how you had places that you could go, this apartment where the door was never locked, with, I think, friends perhaps from college, because it comes up in one of the stories, had, I suppose, the life in the country by then, but you were lonely and wished that in fact you did have somebody. And but I'm astonished that you lay your inner life out like that, with apparently an unawareness of the courage that it takes to do that.
Well, sometimes I start, in circumstances like the present ones, I think of something I want to say, and then I think, well, that's really very private. And I think, what's to be afraid of? The only thing is that what shuts people off from each other, not what opens them out to one another. So why not be open? What's to lose by being open? What you lose is by being shut.
You've spoken and written of having been in analysis, and with respect to the work, you can certainly see, and I'm so long to see you tomorrow, and it came like swallows, the aspects of Freudian psychology. Was this a Freudian analysis that you went into, or was it?
Oh, yes. It was Theodor Reich, who had been a protege of Freud. When he won a prize in Vienna, he was living in an attic, and Freud climbed up God knows how many flights of stairs to tell him. He was, I think, a very good analyst. And he made me feel that he cared about me, which I don't think I could have done anything with him if he hadn't. And I think often analysts don't do that, or don't feel they ought to, perhaps, but he did. He had a strong sense of literature, and he was ambitious for me. And I think he saved my life, because I had a strong tendency towards self-destruction.
Really?
Yes.
This is what put
Direct
you
and indirect, conscious and unconscious.
This is what drew you into analysis?
No, what put me into analysis is that I felt I don't suppose I would have gone to him or anybody if some friend hadn't pushed me into it. But in my early 30s, I felt that I was haunted by the image of a tree. That, you know what happens to trees when you cut the main stem, and they grow out quite large on the side, but they don't grow very tall. And I felt that was happening to me. That my center had been cut out, and I couldn't assume my proper shape. I tend to think in metaphors rather than in ideas direct, abstract ideas.
What was the center that you felt had been cut out?
I didn't seem to be growing. I didn't have anybody to love, and nobody loved me, and I had no wife, no child, I was just an incomplete person.
And at what point in your writing life was this?
I hadn't written The Folded Leaf. I had written They Came Like Swallows, and I was doing stories. I was only in analysis with him a short time. When I got married, he said, "Now you're on your own, and you can come back and talk if you want to, but you better live through this yourself." And I did go back for a short time, but after that, not. The effect of the analytic hour was to find that I was focused on why things happened, not what happened, but why. And you can't write novels that are based on why. You have to, this happened, and this happened, and then, and then, and then, and then. So it took a little while to escape from the preoccupation with motivation back into straight human behavior. But in time, it fell away, and I forgot about it.
In terms of the narrative method of So Long, See You Tomorrow, I can't help but think of what Emily Dickinson said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." As it seems like that is, when you speak of turning yourself into a character, it's you do that with everything. You turn houses into characters, you turn furniture into characters, you turn the dog into a character, you turn... this is... to what extent is this a matter of what we should call the difference between the art of So Long, See You Tomorrow, or any other novel for that matter, and the craft? And what part of that just arises organically from the vision, and what part is something that you know what you're doing there, William Maxwell, in terms of how to tell this story?
One of my older brother's friends wrote me not long ago that I was the most imaginative child he'd ever seen. I think what happened was that when I got into my 30s, all that came to a standstill. And I became preoccupied with myself too much, too exclusively. And what Theodore Reich did was... because he made myself less of a problem to me, made me accept myself. Therefore, and because of the theories that he was presenting me with, which I hadn't known before, I suddenly found myself intensely interested, not in myself, but in other people. And that interest in other people is just by a kind of poetic transposition, done to furniture, done to houses, done to dogs, done to anything. I found that the world around me, the people around me, were so full of interest and so moving, and their lives so beautiful. That from that time on, I was interested in myself, but only as one of them, not as the center of the world. And that was a great release. It made everything possible.
Well, it seems to me, too, that as a child, what you show in your work, that you had that you were a survivor. You weren't a victim. You were a survivor. You know, the question of invention, that we invent ourselves as we go through life.
Brendan Gill wrote a preface to an interview in the Paris Review with me, in which he said I was this odd combination of somebody who was highly sensitive and hard as nails. And that is to say, as an editor, when I had to say, this doesn't work, I was able to say it. I think that is the element of the hardness. It was really just acquired by surviving. And because also my belief in the perfect thing, the perfect story, the right story, was so total that I didn't want to accept something which wasn't right. Couldn't accept something which wasn't right. Not that I had to say in the matter, but if I had to explain the decision of the New Yorker about the matter. So it's all tied up with surviving, I think.
You've brought up the word love, and other people have brought up the word love with respect to William Maxwell and the vision out of which he writes. And have you had a sense that in many ways, too, that you've been just extraordinarily blessed, because it's apparent that that the woman your father chose to marry after your mother died was somebody that I think you must love very much, and she was very wise. She knew not to try to ever presume to replace the mother that you had lost, but instead to be just who she was and what she was. And it strikes me that this in fact was a great blessing for you.
I think also now that I'm such an old man, what delights me is the friendships with the children of my friends, or with people of that age, people around 40. These are new, affectionate, marvelous relationships that make my life like a blossoming tree.
And from whence comes the comfort and the acceptance in William Maxwell of being able to hold two apparently contradictory emotions simultaneously? The anger at your father for having the nerve to remarry, to tear down or to move out of the old house, sell it, that you've never even been back in that house, to then uproot you and move you to Chicago. And yet, as you've said, you were also very much your father's child. You put it very succinctly in one place that I'm trying to remember, where you said that simultaneously, even though you quarreled and had a conflict kind of relationship with your dad, at the same time there was no other model that you could envision.
No other person I trusted so completely.
Person you trusted so.
Well, these dualities are at the very essence of life, don't you think? Things are not simple. It shouldn't be made to appear so.
Let's talk about the relationship between William Maxwell, the writer, and William Maxwell, the editor.
I tried to keep my writing life invisible to the people I was editing. I wanted them to think I was their editor, and that was all there was to me, but of course I wasn't totally invisible. But on the other hand, I was not so successful that it was a problem. During the second half of the 40 years that I was an editor, I had a fair number of writers whose work I loved, and I loved them as people. And I was deeply involved in their work, as deeply involved in their work as I was in my own on the days that I thought about them. When I went home, I didn't think about them. I thought about my own work, and it seemed not a problem.
There's a letter from John Cheever to Alan Gurganus, in which he just, out of the blue, tells his story about you. He says to Alan Gurganus, he says, I'm sure you've probably gathered, he said, Bill Maxwell is a very fastidious person, and by that he meant you were a neatnik, type. And so once he called and he said he was coming to tea, and so Mary scrambled around, she cleaned the house, she picked up everything, and we got tea ready, and here came Mr. Maxwell, and we were having tea, and everything seemed to be full of decorum, and in came Harmon the cat with a dead goldfish in his mouth, and he said, that just wraps up my relationship with the Maxwells in a nutshell. So, with that being said, is there any story you can tell that you think would sum up in a nutshell your relationship with the Cheevers?
Yes, he asked me to leave the house once. I don't remember the goldfish in the cat's mouth. I rather think it didn't happen, and I think it has the higher truth, but I don't think it literally happened. Once, as my wife and I were dressing to go to a dinner party to the Cheevers in the country, I said, I'd had a good day's riding and I was feeling happy, and I said, I'm just going to be myself tonight, my real self. And so I was. I didn't censor my conversation. I said whatever I felt. And there was a young man across the table from me who was talking about his father. And I understood so well what he was saying. It was the kind of joke that really hides pain and isn't a joke. And so, having a couple of drinks in me, I leaned across the table and said, why don't you kill your father? And a few more remarks like that during the course of the evening. And suddenly John was standing in front of me. I was talking to one of the guests. He said, will you go home now? And I was startled, but I realized he meant it. And I got Emmy, and it was dead of winter and snow on the ground, and we got our coats and left. And I got out, and I saw a faint glow on the car lights. I had left the ignition on. And the battery wouldn't turn over. I had to go back in the house and get John and ask him to push us, which he did. Fortunately, they lived at the crest of a hill. And we started downhill and went home. And our relationship was rather cool for maybe about a year, but I told somebody whom I knew would repeat it to him that I thought he was the best short story writer in America, and after that things got better.
What about Salinger? As I understand, though, you're one of the few people that sort of really kind of knows Salinger because of your editing relationship. Is this true?
The reason I still have any relationship with Salinger at all is that I have never talked about him, and so I'm not going to now.
Mm.
He doesn't like to be talked about.
Can you say this much? I mean, has your relationship with Salinger been mostly in correspondence, with letters back and forth about the work? And
it is true that once the proofreader came to me and said, this sentence has to have a comma in it. And it was just going to the printer, and I couldn't reach Salinger. And it seemed clear to me that it needed a comma, and I had great faith in that particular proofreader. And so I said, all right. And he was very sad afterwards because he didn't want that comma. It wasn't necessary. And that's what it was like editing Salinger, really. You couldn't safely put a comma into him, and I made a terrible mistake in agreeing to it. Most of the thing about editing was that I was trying to perform for them the function that my wife does for me, that is to say, a detached person seeing when they were not always writing their best, and if there was something that wasn't their best that could be made their best, say, look, that's all the editing amounted to, really. To have such a love for them and such a sense of what their best was, that if they, through fatigue or one thing or another, had a sloppy paragraph, to get them to fix it.
There were two things that came up in the letters of O'Hara, and or the same thing came up twice, in the letters of O'Hara and then in the letters of John Cheever. And I don't know if it's just one of these wild hair coincidences, you know, that you see when you're reading a lot of material in preparation for an interview. But it was John O'Hara who wrote at length about his distaste for Hemingway's I guess what became Death in the Afternoon. and of having adopted these two bullfighters, and that here he wanted to, he loved them and wanted to see them dead, and what an awful thing he thought that was. And then later in a letter that Cheever wrote, I think again to Alan Gurganus, talking about you as his editor, he says he loves me and would love to see me dead. And he'd seen you as indecipherable, and it seemed to him, now he said it seemed to him, that I think would imply that he realizes this isn't true, that you were a man who mistook power for love, in your role as an editor.
What do you think?
Now, you're not supposed to do that.
You've been talking to me for something like 4 hours. What do you think?
Well, I think that it says more about Cheever than it says about William Maxwell. That's what I think.
Okay. Couldn't we leave it there? He was really a modernist, or moving toward being a modernist. And so at a certain point, fantasy came into his stories, and usually those stories were rejected. At another point, he abandoned the consistency of character. The people did things, characters in his stories did things which was, they had turned up in previous stories, the wop shots, did things which was not in their, as one understood their character, it was not in their character to do. And he released them from this obligation to be a consistent, recognizable character. In doing that, he was departing from Tolstoy and Turgenev and Chekhov, and I couldn't go with him. I think that the work that he did that is surrealistic is perhaps the most admired and by a great many people, so that I don't feel I was right and he was wrong. It's just that I couldn't follow him there.
At the end of So Long, See You Tomorrow, the narrator, the persona, the I, speaks of being on an analyst's couch years later, and in going back into that world of the loss of his mother, saying, thinking that, or intending to have said, I couldn't bear it, says, I can't bear it. Then in an essay about Karen Blixen of Isak Dinesen that you wrote, you speak of her. You obviously identify with her in the loss of her father at early age, and you say that can fix one in an attitude of loss. And how do you get fixed in an attitude of loss and yet go on with the sense of that not becoming your life, the person that the idée fixe, that you're the person who lost his mother, because obviously you have gone on, because you've lived a very productive life, using that as some of your most intense subject matter.
Not every question can be answered. I regret that I have been so repetitious in my work, and each time I've taken up the subject of my death, it was because there was some aspect. Interesting, I said my death when I met my mother's. Each time I've taken up the subject of her death, it was because there was something in my life that I wanted to write about that couldn't be accounted for unless I had also done that. And I couldn't very well simply summarize the fact and produce any emotional effect. So I had to once more make real the catastrophe. I wish I had had a larger talent and not been dependent on this. But that is the person I am, that is the writer I am, and I've had to repeat myself. And I've tried each time to come at it from a new way and to make it real and to justify the repetition. I think the explanation is But in more than the ordinary sense, I owe my life to my mother. Everybody owes their life to their mother because she gave them birth. But I was a very, very fragile child, infant, and was carried around on a pillow and despaired of. I weighed less at 6 weeks than I did when I was born. And my mother was determined that I shouldn't die. And she didn't really get much reassurance that I wasn't going to die until I was about 3 years old. By which time I was old enough to remember. She took me to Peoria to a child specialist and took off all my clothes and stood me on the examining table. And the doctor looked me all over. Then he turned to her and said, "Because of the color of his lips and his fingernails, I can tell that he will live." And it was news to me. I had never intended to die. I was pleased I was going to live, but nevertheless, it hadn't been one of my worries. But it must have, a great weight must have fallen off her shoulders. I think the connection between us, this struggle that she had to keep me alive, produced in me an unbreakable attachment. I'm happy to say that in my old age, I can now see her face again, quite plainly. The face that was gone has come back. With my rational mind, I don't believe that there's a life after this one. I think we're fortunately turned into dust. I can't imagine the next world in which all the people who've ever lived are pushing each other, taking up elbow room. But nevertheless, emotionally, I find I find myself unable to accept the fact that we won't someday see each other again. It's just a matter of love, of emotional attachment. And with some people, love matters more than anything. With lots of people, it doesn't at all. With me, it did, and does. Once, when one of my children was having some therapy, he asked for the family all to be present, and then he began to press me. And what he was pressing about was, if your mother was alive, what would you say to her? Suppose you could talk to her now. And I began to try to answer his question, and at the same time I began to weep, and what I said was, here are these beautiful books that I have written for you. And the tears came in floods, but then I cry too easily.
So that's what you would say to your mother. Here are these beautiful books, and I've written them for you.
Actually, it would be more truthful to say that I wrote them for my wife, because when I didn't quite pull the thing off, she had the thankless task of saying so. And I'm deeply, deeply indebted to her critical judgment. So the truth is that I wrote them for my mother and my wife, and couldn't have written them without my wife.
Thanks for taking so much time with us this week, Mr. Maxwell.
Well, from now on, we'll never not be friends.
Maxwell's books include All the Days and Nights, the collected stories of William Maxwell, So Long, See You Tomorrow, The Chateau, Ancestors, The Folded Leaf, Time Will Darken It, and They Came Like Swallows. These are all available in vintage paperback. The Outermost Dream, a collection of essay reviews he wrote for The New Yorker, is available from Grey Wolf Press. The American Audio Prose Library is a comprehensive collection of distinguished writers reading and discussing their work. Other writers in this series include Eric Bogosian, Laura Hendry, Larry Brown, Robert Stone, E.L. Doctorow, Alice Munro, Elizabeth Spencer, Raymond Carver, Annie Dillard, Toni Morrison, and more than 100 others. For a free catalog of complete listings, write us, the American Audio Prose Library, at the address printed on the label of this recording, or give us a call toll-free at 1-800-447-2275. This recording was produced for the American Audio Prose Library by Kay Bonetti and Sam Stowers, with special assistance and thanks to the staff of the Fales Library at New York University. Sound recordist was Charles Potter. The music is performed by Bob Milne, a pianist specializing in turn-of-the-century American piano styles. He's available for lectures and performances and can be contacted by fax or phone at 1-800-701-5024. Partial funding for this project is provided by the Missouri Arts Council and by the Foundation for Contemporary Performance Arts. For the American Audio Prose Library, this is Kay Bonetti.